Mackenzie Johnston with Tri-State Livestock News, discussing issues facing our cattle industry and solutions that can be put in place in order to achieve fair cattle markets. Today we have the honor of chatting with Senator John Thune of South Dakota. This week you joined Senator Tester, Daines, Rounds, and Booker introducing a resolution to support MCOOL for beef products in the U.S. Can you elaborate on this resolution and what it will do for the American cattle producer?
Obviously, we're taking this in hopefully sending a message that there is a lot of support out there for mandatory country of origin labeling. There have been other attempts to do it in a voluntary way, none of which, at least at this point, have been successful. But I think that, we want to assert that there is a strong constituency, bipartisan, that believes that one of the ways that we can, protect the food supply in this country, which has become an increasingly important issue given coronavirus outbreak and the focus on supply chain and the security of our supply chain. And the food supply chain is probably nothing more important than that. So if you want to ensure the safety of the food supply chain, in this case of our meat, country of origin labeling is a great way to do that, obviously. Secondly, it also ensures that the American consumer can know where their beef is being produced. And we think that is something that most Americans at least want to have the option to buy beef that was born, raised, and slaughtered here in the United States. So it gives us, I think, not only there's a safety issue here, food safety, food chain, food supply issue, but there's also, in my view, at least a quality issue. And if we produce the best in the world, and we want the American people to have the option to select that at the grocery store. So it's it's an ongoing effort. Like I said, we've been involved with these issues for a long time, but we're trying to start drawing attention again to this issue and its importance to the security of our food supply chain.
Will we be seeing a law passed to reinstate MCOOL anytime in the near future?
Well, it remains to be seen. I mean, we'll keep battling. There are, obviously strong constituencies on the other side that are arrayed against us. We've been fighting those in the times we got included in the Farm Bill. There were lots of forces that were resisting that. But so it won't be easy, but I think there's a really compelling argument now, given what's going on in the world and given what's going on in this country with the virus, about supply chain and supply chain management. And, again, what's more important than the food supply chain and the security of the food supply chain? So I just think this is a time when the debate over mandatory country of origin labeling is timely, it's relevant. And yes, we've had these fights before, but I think now in terms of the timing, the circumstances lend themselves right now to, I think, another robust conversation about whether or not we ought to be able to get this done. And it would help, and I think this is really important too, because this has been true in the past, that the industry itself isn't always on the same page. And it's important to get, if we can, to kind of unite all the livestock producer groups out there and hopefully get them, singing off the same song sheet, because the one thing that really hurts our efforts in Congress is if the industry itself is not united on a particular issue. We've seen that in the past, and it would be helpful this time if we could kind of get everybody in the same place.
You're obviously very passionate about MCOOL. Do you feel there are other major issues standing in the way of fair cattle markets today?
I think there are some things that, yes, and obviously right now we've got an agreement from the Department of Agriculture to investigate the issue of whether or not packers are potentially manipulating prices, whether they're engaging in anti-competitive activities and behaviors. And I'm hoping that we will get a go-ahead from the Department of Justice to do the same thing. And we've been trying to weigh in with the administration, the White House, and others to say that, look, you can't have these huge, incredible prices, high prices on box beef and what people are seeing at the grocery store, and then having the producer, absolutely getting crushed right now. And that there's no way you can explain that arithmetically. And so there's got to be an explanation that an investigation would put out there, and I'm hoping that the Department of Justice will follow through with that, follow up with what Department of Agriculture intends to do, to get to the bottom of what's happening. And if there are things that are being done that are in violation of existing antitrust laws, then obviously packers, companies need to be held accountable. And even if there aren't, it may be time for us to revisit and take a look at changing some of those laws. I mean, you've got to have in a free market economy, for a free market economy to work effectively, you've got to have competition. And increasingly now, you've got concentration of market power in the hands of a few companies. In this case, in particular, in beef, you got 80% of the kill now controlled by 4 companies. And there just really isn't a live cash market that exists out there anymore. And so different proposals that are out there, we're looking at some of those. Senator Grassley has one that would require that 50% of the kill be, that it be actually a cash market. There be a live beef market out there in addition to all the captive supply that packers use to, when they need livestock, they pull them out of their own herds as opposed to buying them in a market where you'd have some competition that would give you a fair price. So we're taking a look at all those issues right now, and we're hoping the Department of Justice and Department of Agriculture will give us some answers to some of these questions, because there are questions that need to be answered.
Do you know what kind of a timeline we're looking at with that investigation? How soon we could possibly get some kind of answer?
Yeah, that's the problem with these investigations and these agencies. I mean, especially now, they're so bogged down. And, we've got them working on right now livestock assistance payments that hopefully will start coming out here in the next few weeks. And that's something that we fought to get included in the CARES bill that passed earlier this year. And that is to make sure that with these markets, that we have right now, commodity prices being where they are, which were already in the tank, but then the COVID really put them in a downward spiral, is to provide some direct assistance. And so they're working on that. We've been consulting with them, giving them input on that. Hopefully that comes out. But so I guess what I'm saying is, I know they're busy, but this is an important issue. And I think it's an issue that needs an answer, and then it needs a solution. And so I'm hoping that they will get on it quickly. They've been really slow on the uptake with the investigation into the Tyson plant in Holcomb, Kansas, as a result of that fire back in September. And so, this needs quicker action than that. And so we're going to keep the pressure on, and it would be good for all the organizations out there to keep the pressure on as well.
You mentioned a minute ago that we're dealing with incredible concentration within our processing sector, with 4 large companies controlling 80% of the processing here in America. We've seen that coming on for years now. Why have we let it get to this point as an industry, and why have antitrust laws not been enforced throughout the years?
Well, and that's a good question. My guess is that these companies have really good lawyers and figure out how to get around and skirt around the antitrust laws. But I do think that it's happened over time. It's happened sort of, cumulatively. It didn't happen overnight. And so you kind of get numb to it. And then pretty soon you wake up and you realize, oh my gosh, where are all the processors? And I think one of my arguments has been all along is that, groups need to band together and create our own processing capacity and capability. So you're not dependent upon 4 of these slaughterhouses around the country. And I guess, I think that it's happened slowly over time, but that's what happened to hogs. So pretty much hogs now it's all contract, and there really isn't there's a very small live market in that industry. And if we don't want that to happen to the beef industry, then we're going to have to make some changes. And so I think this is an opportunity to do that. And people have to wake up, though. And again, everybody's got to get on the same page on this. We have to figure out what is the best approach to move forward with, and let's get behind that and try and bring as much political energy behind it as we can.
You talk about everyone getting on the same page. We are very divided as an industry. Oftentimes we fight among ourselves more than we fight these issues facing us. Do you think as an industry we have the capabilities of coming together and finding a solution and getting on the same page to work towards fair cattle markets?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's obviously the goal, Mackenzie. Maybe that's aspirational more than realistic, but I've been around this a long time, and all I know is that if you don't have a united voice in Congress, Congress is divided enough, and it's hard enough getting consensus on something. if the industry itself can't come together, then it really complicates things. And that's not true just with agriculture. There are other groups, other industries where sometimes you have dissenting views within organizations among different sectors of the economy, and it makes it really hard to develop a plan of action that everybody can get behind. And I think there are a lot of different points of view out there, and I understand that it's a diverse country. We get a lot of, and particularly in the rancher world, there's some pretty strong opinions. But I think as much as is possible, it is really important to try and figure out a path forward and try and bring everybody in behind it. Because if you can work together, the chances of succeeding are so much higher. I mean, having been through now 4 farm bills, seeing the fights and the divisions and what ultimately succeeds and what doesn't succeed, a real key to that is getting a unified voice for agriculture on a particular issue. So hopefully that can happen here. I know from past experience it'll be hard, and I know that there are lots of different points of view out there, but it would be extremely helpful to us, I would say, from a political standpoint, to move something if we can get everybody on the same page.
Most definitely. What are you hearing from your constituents as they are dealing with these tough cattle markets?
A lot of frustration, deep-seated frustration, understandably. You look at these cattle prices, complicated obviously by the coronavirus. I'm not going to downplay or in any way minimize the impact that that's had, but there are some structural issues already, in the industry, and we talked a little bit about those when it comes to the alpaca capacity and concentration and those sorts of things. I think that there's just general right now people saying, how am I going to make it? How do I survive this? How do I get through another year? And that's why some of these direct payments that are going to be coming out that will help compensate for some of the price loss associated with, at least with the coronavirus, will provide a little bit of cushion. But in the end, we've got to figure out a way to get a fair price for our producers, create more markets, more demand for the product, and when demand is there, it pushes prices up. And we saw good prices there for quite a few years. Not so much now, and so there's a lot of discouragement, a lot of frustration, and a lot of despair right now in ranch country.
What can individuals do to help bring about these changes to make our voices heard?
I think just engage as much as possible, and make sure that you're participating in the process, engaging with your elected officials, engaging with the organizations if you're members of those organizations, trying to bring about that as much as possible unity that we talked about. And so I just encourage individual members of those organizations, people out there to band together as much as possible, engage, make sure you're speaking with a strong, clear voice. And and that's the way, if you're looking for a political solution, that's kind of the way to make it happen. I think in terms of just the economic factors out there, it's there's a lot of right now, as I said, frustration with the ability to be able to manage the risk and to try and mitigate some of the downside that we're seeing in the industry right now. And I know that there are some options that people can do in terms of forward contracting and trying to manage that risk. But I think the best answer, obviously, is a good live cash market for cattle, where producers can get a fair price for what they raise and produce and grow. Now, I will say that again, from the standpoint of the grocery store, if you look at the cost of beef in a grocery store right now, and you try and equate that to what a rancher is getting for cattle on the hoof, there's such a huge disparity there. That's a thing that's really hard to explain, and that's one of the things I think needs to be corrected.
Brownfield Ag News reported this last week that bankruptcies in agriculture are reaching record highs. Nothing like we saw in the 80s, but they're getting up there higher than they should be. And then also, as you know, suicide rates in agriculture are on the rise. We're facing incredibly tough times in the ag industry. How do you see us working out of this deep hole that we're in?
Well, it's the bankruptcy issue is when you start getting in that position, that's where then the other issue comes into play too. People get so down and so depressed and so full of despair that and that's where the suicide. I want to make sure that people have access to help. The suicide hotlines that are out there and people you can contact to get help in that situation. But I think a lot of this, it gets improved dramatically if you just start seeing prices come back and profitability come back. I think most producers, they just want to do what they do best. I mean, most of them grew up out in the country and they grew up in the business and they just want to make a living and take care of their families. And I think that all they need is a good market and a fair price. And so I think these economic factors will make a big difference in the other issues that we're talking about. But there's no question that if you look at the balance sheets of a lot of our producers right now, the probability, if you will, of more bankruptcies is very real because, it's not like you said, you went through the 80s at all. That was a really, really tough time. And, you had these huge interest rates and a lot of people were heavily in debt. There isn't as much debt in a lot of cases today as there was back then, which is helpful. But if you can't cash flow, if you're losing money every year, you can only do that for so many years, and then pretty soon you've eaten up your equity, and then you're in a world of hurt. So the bankruptcy issue, the suicide issue, all of the things that are associated with that really come back to trying to get the market back, restore the market to where these producers are getting a fair price for what they do.
If for some reason as an industry we can't get on the same page or we can't get some sort of solution passed to straighten out these markets to achieve fair cattle markets, where do you see this cattle industry going in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think that I hope that what comes out of this, obviously, particularly when we get past the whole coronavirus crisis, is as we start to see hopefully market conditions improve, export markets continue to open up, demand come back, and you got demand here domestically. Like I said, I mean that's the frustrating part about this is the price at the supermarket is high. It's the price for the livestock producer that's not, and those things should follow each other. And I think if in the next what comes out of this hopefully is a market that reflects what's actually happening in the marketplace. And if box beef prices are high, if retail prices are high, then that means that the commodity that the price that a livestock producer receives ought to be commensurate or proportionate to that. And today we don't see that. So I think we need to see an equilibrium, a balance come back into these markets, and I hope that's what eventually comes out of this. But it'll take a good amount of work. And I think that the accountability that we're asking for from the packing industry and these investigations that are going to research and look into this, hopefully will be really helpful in shedding some light on those issues. I'm hoping that markets will continue to open up in other places around the world. That will be great markets for American livestock. And we were in the process of getting some of that done when this thing hit. China had made commitments to buy a lot more of American agricultural commodities, and there are other markets like that around the world. So I'm hopeful, I guess, that we'll see some significant improvement there. It would be great, obviously, to see a mandatory country of origin labeling law get into effect, one that could withstand the attacks that are going to inevitably be made against it. So we'll see. I mean, that's, as I said, that's a challenge simply because there isn't unity and consensus within the industry about that. But on these other issues, I think there is. And I think we need to be pushing, full speed ahead, trying to open up markets, create more demand, and try and, in the meantime, provide some bridge relief for our producers, which is what some of these assistance payments will try to achieve.
If you could sum everything up into one sentence, what does the cattle industry need most today? Well,
I mean, a competitive market and a fair price. And I think that happens when you get a competitive market. That's the problem, I think, right now with the industry is you've got this concentration of market power and you don't have, in a free market, you've got to have competition. We've got competition. It tends to demand drives that price to where it ought to be, and a producer can get a fair price for the product. So I just think competitive markets and fair prices.